I went to Niagara Falls once. Actually, I went to Niagara Falls many times because it was only a half-hour drive from my house, and it was the perfect place to take relatives on the third day of a weekend visit, on the day you no longer knew what to do with them. I saw the falls so many times that I almost became inured to them, accustomed to how the cascade of hydrogen and oxygen tumbled over those cliffs. I knew they were a wonder of the world because I'd read as much in books, but I never really saw them as possessing any kind of awesome power until one particular visit when I was 12 and we took a walk along the rocks at the bottom. Halfway across, I looked up into the wind-tossed mist at the way the water fell as one force, graceful and flawless and strong, and it was a prayer to see it. I looked upwards and thought these words: there has to be a God for there to be something like this. That was the faith in my head, breathed there in a single spontaneous moment. It was a kind of exhale, a sigh of relief, as though I no longer had to shift uncomfortably under the weight of my Catholic upbringing, wondering whether or not that learned faith might stand the test of time. My faith would stand the test of time, just like the Niagara Falls, just like God, for isn't his or her or its central premise that there is a forever beyond the end and immortality stretched beyond the cobweb of the world? Even that day, though, it didn't take long for my faith to start to fade, a mere local maximum on a graph of infinite regression. The second thought that came to me on that day, after my total conviction, was that I had to write it down so I wouldn't forget. But by the time the pen was in my hand, I had already lost my assurance. I couldn't write the words, "There is a God," without the very syllables seeming base and insincere. I couldn't write the words without remembering the boy who had brought a model of the falls into my 4th grade class for a science project. The falls had migrated, he told us, stabbing his finger at his miniature replication. They had edged backwards over the centuries as the rocks underneath eroded, crumbled to pieces under the weight of all that water. Even the unchanging changes. In this world, everything comes to an end. This ultimate, inevitable finality is the physical fact that unravels all the Sunday school lessons I was ever taught. I was raised Catholic, born into a world of Hail Marys and hosts, communion wine and confession, Sunday school and sin. I was not raised to parrot, but I was raised to pray. I was not indoctrinated, but I was raised to believe. Most times now, though, I find this too difficult. I cannot reconcile an infinite forever with the abrupt fleetingness of everything around me. I cannot reconcile a universe where God is real and all-powerful and benevolent, and a world where the headlines are scribbled over in sorrow, a world where terrible, unspeakable tragedies happen every day. Not to me, but around me. I cannot be convinced that they are only part of some greater plan, that God has sent us over mountains only so we will be prepared for the valleys, has sent us hardship only to teach us how to grow up, to become more ourselves. I cannot rationalize God, and the problem isn't science. It's history, philosophy, psychology, literature that I cannot fit him or her or it in with. I can see a God in a world with evolution, but not a God in a world with evil. To me, these doubts make sense. They make entirely too much sense. Sometimes I almost declare the matter decided. I almost say, okay, I ought to be an atheist. Except that I can't, because I'm not sure that God hasn't escaped the logic of my proof from the first. Maybe God isn't supposed to make sense. Maybe God isn't supposed to be rationalized. Here's the twist, the contradiction, the self-defeating paradox. I still believe in God. Despite all I've said, I still go to Mass, week in, week out, even now that I've moved out of my parents' house and no longer have anyone tugging me along and telling me to get in the car. Some unshakable faith cleaves hard to the hollows of my heart, and I don't know if it ought to be there, but I do know why it is. It has to do with a story that is not mine, but that I feel compelled to impart to you anyway. I used to think that you could only tell your own story, that it was all you had a right to, but I'm not sure that that's entirely correct. Maybe there are some things that aren't yours, that can never be yours, but that you just have to say because you love them too much, because they mean too much for you to resist. So here it goes. There was once a young husband and a young wife. The husband was the son of a coal miner born in western Pennsylvania, and he was never rich, not even close to it. The wife was from Kentucky. They had 10 kids. The first was a baby girl, and the second was 2, but she didn't live long. She died in the hospital on an operating table. The doctor was young. When he came out to the waiting room to say that she was gone, his toes dragged and he gulped too many times, as though the words were in his throat and he couldn't quite reach them. There were 6 more girls, and the young husband loved them all, but he kept hoping, waiting, praying for a son. And when God, or chance, or fate, or Buddha, or Zeus, or whatever, gave an answer to his prayer, sent a little boy down to be the 9th child in the family, it was a cruel answer. It was punctuated, perfunctory. The little boy couldn't stay. There was a tumor in his head, and it killed him when he was 2 years old. It killed him despite the careful way his mother washed up every toy of his that ever touched the floor before handing it back to him. It killed him despite the way his 9-year-old sister watched him on the couch as he smiled his last smile, a moment she would never forget. It killed him despite the healing waters his father dipped him in at Lourdes after the diagnosis, the healing waters his father believed in. There was another son after, but that was only a new story, not a happy ending. The kids grew up. The young husband grew older. He watched another child die in a hospital, this one his firstborn, from leukemia. She said something meaningful before she died. One of his other daughters doesn't believe it. The husband was the next to die. He had grown older, but not old enough to perish of a heart attack. He did, anyway. That's what you might call the end. It's a sad story, one I don't have the right to tell, not really. A story I know only anecdotally, because I happen to be the firstborn daughter of the little girl who watched her baby brother smile all those years ago, whose father died at the age of 63. I was 3 years old the year he breathed his last, and I don't remember any of this or any of them. It is not my story, not my grief that I put before you. It is not my story, but I am prefigured in it. It is the backdrop of my life, the reality I am not inhibited by, but have always been aware of. It is the backdrop that contains the words my mother spoke the day I can trace, not my doubts, but my first confession of them back to. We were standing behind the chain-link fence of a baseball diamond. My brother's team was playing. I think it was cold outside. I said, in the whisper of one betraying something treacherous, I sometimes wonder if there is no God. My mother said, you think I never have since the day that I was 9 and woke up wondering why God would take my little brother away? It is not my story, but my story is impossible without that one. I am the product of the words my mother never spoke, and the ones she did. My aunts, my uncle, my grandfather, they are all dead, and I thought for a long time that meant their stories were over, but I'm not certain anymore. I think of my grandfather whenever I enter an empty church, the way he used to do, calling the practice, making a visit. I think of him whenever I bend my knee before the altar, whenever I genuflect, a word irrevocably tied up with pop-up, because he always did that as well. I never saw him make a visit. I never saw him genuflect. Someone else must have told me, and still, I remember. I remember that my grandfather was Catholic all his life, even though his heart was torn too many times to count under the watch of some God who didn't or couldn't stop it. My mother, who watched all this and buried him, has been Catholic all her life as well. So whenever I wonder if I ought to give up on the whole business, the whole institution, I think of them. And I go on, trying to believe the best that I can. None of this means that this story, the one that's not mine but that I'm telling anyway, has a happy ending. I can't give it that. But I can wonder if it has an ending. I can tell you that I'm not certain that there are endings. Sometimes I wonder if everyone's story is just a part of everyone else's, all the way back to Adam and Eve, if you happen to believe in them, which I do only figuratively. Under the bed, back in my own bedroom in the suburbs of upstate New York, there is a stack of stapled poems my grandfather wrote. Like the clippings of so many newspapers, they are colored over in sorrow, a sadness such that I have still not read through them all. And yet it is these words that form the inaudible parenthetical that comes after every time I say, shyly, what I want to do with my life. I want to be a writer, I say, adding only in parentheses, like he was. There are still counter-arguments to be made of all this, of course. You could tell me that I'll be dead someday, and so will everyone else, and there will be no one else to tell the stories anymore, because there's no heaven and no God to help us. Maybe that will all be true, but it isn't yet. You could tell me that there's no God to help us now, and you could be right about that. You could be right. I have only one defense, which is itself just 17 words. Like my grandfather's story, these words aren't mine. Like my grandfather, their author is dead. The girl who wrote them was Eddie Hillesum, and she was a Jewish writer killed by the Nazis she didn't flee from because she was too busy helping everyone else. She is dead, but her words remain. In her diary, on a page I have dog-eared, and a book I keep always on my shelf, she wrote, "And if God does not help me go on, then I shall have to help God." When I doubt very much, there are still two things I believe in. The first is those words. The second is that my grandfather, the one I hardly remember, the one I know only through stories, would want me to believe in them too.